Hi, I'm Todd Peterson. I'm on the team here at One Identity, and today we're going to talk about compliance, but more specifically about identity and access management's role in compliance. So you've got tons of vendors out there, us included, that are going to tell you the only way to be compliant is to buy our stuff and then you'll all of a sudden magically be compliant. That's not true. Compliance is a really multifaceted thing. You can be more compliant with identity and access management solutions, but it's certainly not the end-all be-all of compliance. But I'd like to talk about where identity and access management can help you in compliance. So let's turn to the board. First is that every regulation, whether it's PCI, whether it's SOX, GDPR, HIPAA, or even a best practices framework like ISO 9001. Every single one of those regulations boils down to a few common themes. First is you need to protect sensitive data. In most cases, it's you protect your customer data or the personal information of your employees, etc. Second is to keep the bad guys out. You don't want to get somebody that you don't know getting a hold of that personal data of people. You want to avoid unnecessary exposure. You want to reduce risk. You want to reduce the opportunities for people to get in and get to this stuff. And then most of them have some sort of a sense of what you should do if an incident occurs, who you tell, what your obligations are, etc. As far as identity and access management is concerned, it really boils down to three principles of identity and access management. The first is access control. That's things like passwords, things like multi-factor authentication, things like setting up somebody's role. How do you make sure that the access somebody is given is actually the access that person should have? Nothing more, nothing less. The second one is separation of duties. That's kind of the classic incidence of, accounts payable and accounts receivable can't be the same guy. But there's all kinds of areas within identity and access management where you could have a conflict of interest, where separation of duties is absolutely necessary. So separation of duties for our purposes is basically making sure that the access somebody has is the access they should have. So the first one is about making they have secure access. The second is about making sure they have the right access. And then finally, every regulation has the need for you to audit. That's to prove that your access control and your separation of duties are actually happening in the way they should. So for access control, there's a number of identity and access management technologies that really have a big play and a big benefit in any effort to be compliant or to satisfy any specific regulation. Let's talk about a few of those in the kind of the chapter and verse of the various regulations that they satisfy. We'll start with authentication management. That's the stuff you do to make sure that the person logging in is actually who they say they are. Things like, strong passwords, making sure that, the access is all appropriate. For GDPR, it satisfies 1.2.5. For SOX, it's AS5. For HIPAA, 164.3. There's a lot in 164, but the 0.3 is specifically what you're after. For PCI, you've got 2.1, you've got 2.5, and you've got 8.1. And then for NIST, it's 3.5.2. So as you can see, that just that one simple identity and access management technology really satisfies a lot of your compliance needs. That same type of needs are also satisfied by multi-factor authentication. So that's rather than just relying on the password, you've got a second factor. I type in my password, but I also type in the code that is sent to my phone or something along those lines. So that also satisfies 1.25 in GDPR, AS5 in SOX, 164.3 in HIPAA, but it does 8.3 in PCI and 3.5.2.2 in NIST as well. Then we can move on to provisioning. So that's the processes you go through to set up a user's account, but also to turn off a user's account so that when they authenticate, the access that you are controlling is actually appropriate because of the rights and stuff they've been given. Again, GDPR is 1.25, SOX is AS5, HIPAA is 164.3, and then for PCI you've got 2.4 as well as 8.1. And then for NIST, you've got 3.1.1, 3.8.2, and also 3.9.2. And then finally, we'll move on to privileged access management. So it's the same idea as controlling an end user's access, but this is for the administrators and the super powerful privileged accounts, which are really the most dangerous, which are really what compliance is trying to control and what the bad guys are trying to get a hold of. So privileged account management is probably the most important aspect of any identity and access management program as far as compliance is concerned. So for GDPR, again, your 1.25, SOX, again, your AS5, HIPAA, again, your 164.3, PCI is 2.1, 2.5, and 8.1, and then for NIST, it's 3.1.1. So as you can see, these access control technologies and practices, if implemented correctly, can really help you with a lot of the trouble with the access control aspects of your compliance program. So let's move on to this separation of duties portion. Okay, so from separation of duties, remember that's the making sure that the role somebody has, the job they're doing is actually appropriate, that their access rights match what they should have, not something anomalous. So for GDPR, the privileged access management technologies, your privileged access credential password vaulting, your session audit things, the analytics that go into making sure that an administrator has the correct access, and even the delegation of that access to make sure that they only have as much as they need to do their job. For GDPR, that satisfies 2.1.5. For SOX, Privileged Access Management Technologies, satisfy AS12. HIPAA, again, it's 164.3. PCI, it's 7.1. And NIST actually satisfies 2, 3.1.2 and 3.4.2. So privileged access management, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the most important thing, very important from separation of duties. Let's move on to provisioning and deprovisioning. You remember that was about setting up somebody's rights so that their appropriate access is granted, not inappropriate access, and then turning those rights off when they no longer need it. So separation of duties is a key there because you put them in the correct group, put them in the correct role, they don't conflict with another group or another role. So here again, we've got GDPR is also 2.1.5, SOX is also AS12, HIPAA is also 164.3. For PCI, we have 7.1, but also 6.4. And then for NIST, it's 3.1.2 again and 3.5.2. And finally, moving on to identity analytics. That's a very specialized and emerging discipline of identity and access management that looks at the collection of rights across a user population and finds anomalies. Perhaps one person in a particular group has more permission than everybody else in that group. Perhaps somebody has rapidly escalated the level of permissions that they have. Those are all red flags that perhaps something is wrong, and compliance doesn't want you to have something wrong. So the identity analytics capabilities will also satisfy 2.1.5 in GDPR, AS12 in SOX, 164.3 in HIPAA, 7.1 again in PCI, and then also 3.1.2 in NIST. So separation of duties combined with access control gives you that controlling nature, helps you to know that the access people have is right and that they're actually getting to the right stuff. So let's now move on to the audit aspects of these regulations and what they require. Okay, the third leg in the stool of identity and access management as far as compliance is concerned is audit. So this is how do you prove that the access control and the separation of duties are correct. But it's also a little bit of detecting when something is going wrong. So not only you prove you do it right, but you also find things that may be happening, that you don't want to happen, so you can stop them. So let's talk about privileged access management. Remember, earlier we talked about how that's controlling the passwords, controlling who has access to what, and giving them only the rights they need to do their jobs from an administrative standpoint. For GDPR, a privileged access management still satisfies 1.25. SOX is AS15 again. HIPAA is 164.3 again. PCI is 10.1 and NIST is 3.2.2. So again, provisioning and deprovisioning. Because you're setting up these rights, because those are controlling what people can access, making sure that the separation of duties are in place, it's important that you're able to prove that that happens. One of the primary compliance requirements is what's called attestation, or sometimes it's called periodic recertification, where the line of business people have to go in every 6 months or 9 months or whatever the regulation says and say that I know who works for me and I know that the access they have is actually what it should be, and I'm willing to sign on the line here to verify that. So that's a big component of pretty much every regulation, and it's really important. And your provisioning solution should include the ability to do attestations. So from a GDPR standpoint, again, we're 1.2.5, SOX is again AS15, HIPAA is again 164.3, PCI is 10.1 but also 6.4, and then NIST is 3.12.1. So finally, let's talk about identity analytics. Remember the last on separation of duties, identity analytics was identifying those instances of permissions that exceed what they should be. But that has an audit component as well. You have to be able to prove that it is. It has to report back to somebody so they can actually take action. So from an identity analytics standpoint, GDPR satisfies 125 again, AS15 on SOX, 164.3 in HIPAA, 6.4 in PCI, and then again that's 3.12.1 in NIST. So if compliance is something that you're facing, I encourage you to look at how identity and access management can help. Here at One Identity, we offer the industry's broadest portfolio of identity and access management solutions, covering everything we've talked about here. We have privileged account management solutions, provisioning solutions, attestation solutions, identity analytics, password management solutions, multi-factor authentication. We really have a broad range, and all of them can dramatically help your compliance efforts. If you'd like to learn more about how identity and access management can help you in compliance, and specifically how the One Identity solutions can play in your compliance efforts, I invite you to visit us on the web at oneidentity.com/compliance. Thanks a lot.